Morning sunlight slanted through the palms of Mar-a-Lago, gilding the veranda in a quiet glow that did not match the noise about to erupt beyond those gates. Inside, Donald J. Trump sat at a long table stacked with newspapers whose headlines still spoke his name in bold type. For months he had teased it, hinted it, let the idea simmer online until the question no longer sounded unthinkable. Could he run again? Not for revenge. Not for closure. But for history itself. The hum of the ocean mixed with the low voices of aides pacing behind him. Phones vibrated with unread messages. TV screens flickered with pundits already arguing about what he hadn't even said yet. Trump glanced at the coverage, a faint smirk touching his face. He had always understood the power of anticipation. Politics was theater, and he, its most controversial star, was about to announce an encore no one was prepared for. When the words finally reached the world, when the suggestion of a third term left his lips in a private fundraiser, caught on a supporter's recording, the reaction was volcanic. Cable networks broke programming, push notifications screamed across millions of phones. Commentators sputtered in disbelief, then leaned in closer, realizing that disbelief only made the story bigger. Supporters cheered online, flooding feeds with hashtags of defiance and loyalty. Critics labeled it a constitutional nightmare in the making. And through it all, Trump remained silent, watching the chaos unfold like a director enjoying the first screening of his own film. In Washington, lights burned late in offices that usually slept by midnight. Lawyers pored over the 22nd Amendment, scholars dug into dusty precedents and found none that fit. Could a man barred from election to a third term still serve if nominated through some procedural twist? Theories multiplied faster than facts. Impossible, some insisted. Not with him, others warned. The Constitution had never faced a personality quite like Donald Trump's, and America knew it. Reporters chased sources, analysts rehearsed sound bites, and every political campaign recalibrated. The Democrats saw opportunity, a rallying cry to defend democracy itself. The Republicans saw risk and promise tangled together. For Trump's loyal base, it was revelation. "He's the only one who fights," said a man interviewed outside a rally in Ohio, the wind whipping red banners behind him. Why stop at 2 terms when the country still needs saving? That sentiment traveled faster than the news cycle. Conservative talk shows painted the proposal as symbolic defiance, not literal intent, until Trump himself reposted an article titled, "The People Want Me Back." The repost came without comment, but none was needed. His followers read meaning into every pixel he touched. Within hours, the movement had a name, #ThirdTermTruth. Meanwhile, inside Mar-a-Lago, the former president studied the reaction with quiet calculation. He knew the Constitution's barrier stood firm, but he also knew politics was about perception. If people believed he deserved another term, laws could bend, institutions could sway, and narratives could shift. He didn't need legality to shape history, just belief. At night, when the estate emptied of guests and the noise softened to the hush of the Atlantic, Trump often walked alone through the colonnade, his reflection trailing in the dark glass. He thought about legacy not as nostalgia but as strategy. Washington had mocked him, impeached him twice, buried him in investigations, yet here he was, dominating headlines again. The very system that tried to exile him couldn't stop talking about him. Maybe that was power greater than the presidency itself. Still, there were moments of silence heavy enough to stir doubt. In those pauses, he wondered what it would take to sustain this momentum, whether America's anger could remain hot enough to forge another victory. Power demanded oxygen, and outrage had always been his flame. But flames, even the brightest, eventually flicker. Across the country, the public divided itself into camps as predictably as tides. Believers, skeptics, alarmists, opportunists. Town halls turned into verbal battlegrounds. Professors updated lectures overnight to address the third-term question. Late-night hosts opened monologues with mock campaign slogans, while serious news anchors adopted grave tones usually reserved for wars or recessions. The spectacle was irresistible. Even those who despised him couldn't look away. For ordinary Americans, the debate reached their kitchen tables. Some remembered the roaring economy before the pandemic, others the chaos that followed. To his critics, a third-term tease felt like a threat to stability. To his fans, it was redemption deferred. Every argument came laced with memory, the rallies, the tweets, the impeachments, the Capitol images burned into screens. America's conversation became a mirror of its divide, half of it echoing hope, the other half disbelief. Inside the Republican Party, strategists met behind closed doors, whispering about timing, optics, and donor fatigue. Some urged restraint. We can't let him hijack 2028 this early. Others argued the opposite. Without him we're nothing. Even those who privately wished he'd retire admitted the truth: they needed his gravitational pull. Every fundraiser, every poll, every primary still orbited his name. And somewhere, in a quiet hotel suite overlooking New York's skyline, a network of former aides planned the next step. A documentary-style rollout, coded messages dropped in interviews, symbolic rallies held in states with deep constitutional lore: Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. They weren't selling legality. They were selling myth. The myth of unfinished destiny. Outside the political class, social media became a storm. Memes mixed with manifestos, conspiracy channels claimed hidden amendments, legal experts threaded nuanced explanations that few read past the first tweet. The algorithm loved it all. The more extreme the post, the faster it spread. On TikTok, young creators reenacted imagined scenes of a 2029 inauguration. On YouTube, historians dissected the founding fathers' intent. America had turned its constitution into content. Through every screen and conversation, one thing was undeniable. Donald Trump had once again seized control of the national narrative without officially declaring anything. Whether he truly intended to test the law or merely to test loyalty no longer mattered. The reaction itself was proof of influence, proof that even out of office, he could summon the storm. As the first week of coverage ended, the polls began to shift subtly, then sharply. Approval within his base climbed 5 points. Donations spiked. Rival Republican candidates paused campaign ads to reassess strategy. And in that moment, watching the metrics rise, Trump realized something his critics never did. Power isn't always taken, it's maintained by remaining impossible to ignore. The nation woke up to shockwaves that hadn't yet faded from the night before. Coffee cups trembled in the hands of anchors reading from teleprompters that seemed to rewrite themselves mid-sentence. The question of a third term wasn't supposed to exist. It was the kind of idea confined to speculative fiction or political nightmares. Yet here it was, front and center, alive and pulsing through every channel, every timeline, every conversation. In living rooms across America, families watched in disbelief. A retired veteran in Texas, eyes sharp with both pride and pain, whispered, "He's not done yet." In Los Angeles, a teacher muttered under her breath, "This is how democracies fall." Across the Midwest, truck stops echoed with debates that blended loyalty, frustration, and disbelief. Every emotion America had buried since the last election resurfaced: rage, hope, exhaustion, defiance, all reignited by one man's refusal to fade quietly into history. The media tried to contain it, but every attempt to explain only fueled the fire. CNN rolled constitutional experts onto panels like chess pieces. Fox News filled screens with triumphant montages of Trump-era rallies, red hats waving under stormy skies. MSNBC warned of authoritarian echoes. Even neutral outlets struggled to keep composure because neutrality was impossible in a story this charged. Each frame, each word choice, each headline carried ideological shrapnel. And yet, behind all the noise, Trump was silent. For nearly a week, he let the chaos spin unchecked. He didn't need to speak. America was speaking for him. It was his oldest strategy: withdraw just enough to make absence itself a spectacle. The silence became oxygen for speculation. Was he serious? Was this a bluff? A test balloon? Every theory multiplied like reflections in a hall of mirrors. Inside Mar-a-Lago, tension simmered beneath the gold and marble calm. Loyalists gathered in private rooms, some giddy, others uneasy. "This is genius," one advisor whispered, pacing. "He's rewriting the conversation again." Another shook his head, muttering, "He's playing with fire." And Trump, leaning back in his chair, watched them argue, the faintest glimmer of amusement crossing his face. He'd seen fear in politics before, but not this kind of fear. This was reverence disguised as worry. He knew what they couldn't admit out loud: America was addicted to him. Every institution that claimed to oppose him secretly depended on him for relevance. The networks needed his name to survive. The opposition needed his shadow to rally their base. Even the late-night hosts who mocked him nightly owed him their highest ratings. He wasn't just a man, he was a narrative engine, and America couldn't turn it off. That realization wasn't arrogance, it was calculation. He leaned forward, eyes glinting under the chandelier. "They think they can control the story," he said softly, more to himself than the room. "But the story is me." By the next morning, anonymous leaks began to surface: emails, transcripts, sources close to the former president. The effect was immediate and intentional. Every leak contradicted the last, ensuring the chaos stayed alive. Some claimed he was exploring a legal loophole involving a vice presidency run. Others whispered about a shadow ticket, where loyal states would challenge the Constitution itself. None of it was verified. All of it was believed. Cable networks held emergency roundtables. Editorial boards scrambled to issue statements. Universities rushed to host public forums titled The Third Term Question. Can it happen? Students packed auditoriums, some waving flags, others holding protest signs. For the first time in decades, constitutional law was trending on TikTok. America wasn't just debating policy anymore, it was questioning its own reflection. Meanwhile, the White House, now led by Trump's successor, issued a cautious response that only made things worse. "We respect all opinions," the press secretary said nervously. That phrase, so bland, so harmless, was instantly interpreted as weakness. Within hours, headlines screamed, "White House responds to Trump's third-term plan." The press secretary's comment, meant to defuse tension, poured gasoline on it instead. That night, Trump made his first appearance since the leak of a private fundraiser in Florida. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and anticipation. Cameras weren't allowed, but phones caught glimpses. Trump walking to the podium, smiling like a man who knew the world waited on every breath. "You know," he began, voice steady, deliberate, "they tell me I can't do it. They tell me it's not possible. But they also told me I'd never win the first time." The crowd erupted. Some stood, fists raised. Others sat frozen, unsure if they'd just witnessed history or heresy. The applause swelled until it became indistinguishable from thunder. Trump raised his hand not to silence them, but to let the sound wash over him. He paused, scanning faces like an actor gauging the perfect moment to deliver his final line. "If the people want it," he said slowly, "who's going to stop them?" The clip went viral within minutes. No network broadcasted it officially, yet everyone had seen it. The phrase, "who's going to stop them?" became the most quoted line in America. It appeared on banners, bumper stickers, and protest signs. The question had shifted. It wasn't about legality anymore, it was about willpower. Could a movement fueled by raw belief rewrite the rules that once seemed unbreakable? In Washington, panic took on a new tone. Lawmakers from both parties held closed-door meetings that stretched past midnight. Some spoke of constitutional crisis. Others whispered about strategy, optics, and survival. For every leader who condemned Trump publicly, two others called his allies privately, desperate to gauge the wind. The city felt like a volcano under a thin crust of calm. Man, through it all, Trump slept soundly. History favored those who understood drama, and he was the master dramatist. The outrage, the fear, the adoration, they were all forms of energy, and he knew how to harness them. He didn't need to announce a campaign yet. The story itself was the campaign. In the weeks that followed, polls swung like pendulums. Trump's favorability among independents dipped, but his dominance within the Republican base soared. Donors returned, money flowed, rallies reignited. Each event was framed as "Save America Again," the word again whispered with heavy implication. Meanwhile, America's mood darkened. Talk shows became arenas of moral debate. Families stopped speaking over dinner. A line had been crossed, not legally but emotionally. Every citizen felt forced to choose between two visions of the same country. One where tradition was sacred, and another where tradition bowed to will. In late October, as autumn leaves fell across Washington's monuments, a group of constitutional scholars released a joint letter warning of a grave democratic reckoning. It was signed by over 200 academics. But by the time it hit the news, it was already buried beneath another viral clip: Trump laughing at a rally saying, "They're scared. That means we're winning." The crowd roared again. Cameras flashed. Chants rose into the night. The letter, so carefully written, vanished into the digital abyss, forgotten before midnight. At that moment, somewhere between spectacle and strategy, America crossed an invisible line. It wasn't just about Trump anymore. It was about the fragility of truth itself, about how easily conviction could replace reality when delivered with confidence and drama. Autumn settled over Washington like a bruised purple dusk, cold rain, the slow throb of a city holding its breath. The Capitol's white dome glowed against the storm clouds, a beacon of permanence now trembling under the weight of speculation. Inside its halls, senators paced marble corridors that had seen war declarations, impeachments, and scandals, yet nothing quite like this. The question of a third term was no longer an abstraction. It was an obsession. Behind closed doors, aides whispered of contingency plans. Legal teams drafted statements they prayed they'd never have to release. Intelligence briefings arrived thicker than usual: polling data, foreign reactions, security assessments. The nation's institutions, built on paper and precedent, suddenly felt as fragile as glass across Pennsylvania Avenue. The Supreme Court glowed faintly through the mist, its columns unmoving as if the building itself refused to blink. Reporters gathered outside, drenched but relentless, shouting questions that bounced uselessly off marble. Can he really do it? Would they intervene? The justices, silent as statues, offered no answers. Silence in this moment was louder than law. Meanwhile in Mar-a-Lago the storm took another shape. The ballroom, dressed in gold and red, pulsed with music and flashbulbs. Donors clinked glasses, influencers filmed every moment. On the stage stood Trump, framed by American flags and chandeliers, the architect of his own mythology. He raised his hand, palm open as though blessing the crowd. They say America's tired, he began, voice booming over the speakers. They say the fight's over. But I don't see tired faces, I see warriors. The audience erupted. Every cheer was a vote, every shout an oath. The cameras caught it all, the defiant grin, the tilt of his head, the cadence that blurred speech and sermon. 2 terms weren't enough to fix what they broke, he said, leaning closer to the microphone. Maybe it takes 3. The room shook. Confetti cannons hissed. It was half rally, half revelation, and everyone present felt they were witnessing something that should have been impossible. Outside, lightning split the sky in 2, illuminating the ocean like a warning. But inside, no one noticed. The clip reached social media before dawn. Overnight, it gathered tens of millions of views. Hashtags flooded timelines. Hashtag term 3 now, hashtag the people decide, hashtag save America again. Influencers filmed tearful reactions. Conspiracy channels called it the prophecy fulfilled. Even those who mocked it amplified it. Algorithms rewarded outrage, and outrage was endless fuel. By morning the world responded. European leaders issued cautious statements about respecting democratic transitions. Canadian talk shows debated constitutional crises south of the border. In Moscow and Beijing, state media smiled behind neutral phrasing, framing America's turmoil as proof that the West's moral superiority had cracked. And yet, Trump's approval numbers climbed again. The more the world doubted him, the more his supporters believed. He had turned resistance itself into evidence of righteousness. Inside the campaign war Roman opulent suite converted into command center, maps glowed on digital screens. Advisors analyzed every county, every demographic. The base is surging, said one data chief. We're seeing numbers we haven't seen since 2016. Another warned, but the moderates are scared. They think this talk of a 3rd term means dictatorship. Trump leaned over the table, eyes narrowing. Then we stop calling it that, he said. We call it unfinished business. The phrase stuck. Within hours, shirts, hats, and banners appeared online. Unfinished Business 2028. It was brilliance disguised as simplicity, a slogan vague enough to inspire, bold enough to provoke. Commentators argued about what it meant. Trump didn't clarify. Ambiguity was his sharpest weapon. Meanwhile, journalists struggled to keep pace with the fever dream of events. Every morning began with fact checks. Every evening ended with retractions drowned by new rumors. The story moved faster than truth. Editors, exhausted, began to question whether accuracy even mattered when half the country no longer trusted facts. We're not covering politics anymore, one senior producer confessed. We're covering faith. And faith was spreading. In church gatherings across the South, pastors spoke of divine missions and unfinished destinies. Trump's name echoed from pulpits not as politician but as vessel flawed yet chosen. In small towns of Ohio, families gathered for watch parties, cheering at live streams of rallies like spectators at a cosmic sporting event. But far from the cheering crowds, there were those who watched in dread. Civil rights lawyers drafted contingency plans in case protests erupted. Students organized campus marches under banners reading, 2 terms is enough. Veterans who had fought in distant wars stared at the news and wondered whether the country they defended still believed in limits. Inside intelligence agencies, analysts examined the data with grim precision. Online chatter hinted at militias preparing for the storm. Threat levels quietly rose. It's rhetoric now, said one official, but rhetoric can turn real. Few disagreed. Then came the leak, the memo no one was supposed to see. A former campaign aide, fired weeks earlier, shared documents suggesting discussions about a constitutional referendum. The memo was vague, half-formed, but the implication was explosive. A plan to challenge the 22nd Amendment directly through popular vote. Within minutes, news outlets pounced. Trump allies plot to overturn term limits, screamed headlines. Trump denied it, of course. Fake news, he tweeted. Desperate losers. But he didn't sound angry. He sounded energized. The controversy was oxygen. That night he appeared on a conservative talk show, smirking into the camera. They're afraid of the people deciding, he said. Why are they so afraid of democracy? The host grinned, sensing the viral moment. You mean a referendum? I mean freedom, Trump replied. The clip exploded. The word referendum became a rallying cry. Protesters on both sides flooded streets, one side waving flags of defiance, the other signs quoting the Constitution. Helicopters hovered above crowds that stretched for miles. The air smelled of sweat, rain, and tension thick enough to taste. From above, the images looked like two nations colliding, one crimson, one blue, one chanting, "Let him run again," the other shouting, "No kings in America." The chants merged into a single roar that shook the streets of Washington, echoing between monuments built to honor unity. For the first time since the Civil War, the word union didn't sound guaranteed. As night fell, Trump watched the footage on multiple screens, the glow painting his face with flickering light. Outside, the ocean crashed against the Florida shore, wild and relentless. They said I couldn't change the world, he murmured. I already did. His reflection in the dark window smiled back, older, heavier, but still burning with the same defiance that had carried him from boardrooms to ballots to the brink of legend. And somewhere, in the silence between waves, he whispered to himself the question that now haunted a nation. What if history isn't done with me yet? The storm came not in silence but in screens. Across America, televisions flickered with breaking news banners, timelines overflowed, and anchors spoke with the urgency of a nation on the brink. Every major network carried the same story, not war, not crisis, but words. Just a few sentences that had shaken the entire republic. Donald Trump hints at third term sparks constitutional firestorm. 4 hours, every commentator had something to say. Legal experts quoted the 22nd Amendment as if reciting scripture. Political rivals mocked him, late-night comedians laughed, and yet behind the laughter there was fear. Fear that somehow, once again, he would find a way to bend the rules of the system that tried so hard to contain him. But inside Mar-a-Lago, the chaos sounded different. There were no alarms, no shouting, just the soft thud of headlines being printed and the murmurs of advisors walking briskly down gilded hallways. Trump was in the study again, the same one where he had once written notes for speeches that changed elections. This time he sat alone, watching the screens, watching the world react to him just as it always had. His reflection stared back from the TV glass. Older, sharper. Tired, perhaps, but not defeated. Every frame, every headline, every voice that condemned him only seemed to remind him of something deeper. That he was still the center of the story. And for Trump, that had always been enough. He leaned back in his chair, the light of the screen painting the room in cold blue hues. Somewhere behind him, the ocean waves hit the shore, soft, steady, relentless. He murmured, almost to himself, they said I was done. They said it's over. But look at them, they can't stop talking about me. An aide entered quietly, holding a phone. Sir, the statement from the RNC just dropped. They're distancing themselves. Trump smiled faintly without turning. Of course they are, he said. They always do. Until they need the crowd again. It wasn't anger in his tone, it was something closer to amusement or maybe even sadness. For all the bluster, for all the fire, there was still a man who understood exactly how fragile power could be. He had tasted it, the cheers, the planes, the applause that shook stadiums, and he knew how quickly it could turn to silence. But this time he wouldn't let silence have the last word. Outside, the media vans lined the Florida roads. Protesters and supporters faced each other in the heat, signs raised, voices raw. One side screamed, "No third term." The other chanted, "Do it again." And amid the noise, the lines between politics and faith blurred completely. Trump's words had turned into prophecy. He hadn't promised to run again, but he hadn't denied it either. It was the perfect storm. Just enough mystery to drive outrage, just enough conviction to spark belief. By midnight, hashtags had trended across the world. Journalists called it a constitutional crisis. But his followers called it something else. A calling. Somewhere in the Midwest, an elderly veteran sat in front of his TV and whispered, "He's not finished." In Texas, a small-town pastor told his congregation, "Maybe God isn't done with Trump yet." And in Manhattan, a young political analyst admitted on air, whether you love him or hate him, he still controls the conversation. That was the real fallout, not the political noise, but the emotional divide. The same wound that never healed since 2016 had been reopened, deeper than before. And through that wound, Trump's voice echoed once more, uncontainable. Inside the mansion, the screens now showed aerial shots of protests, talking heads arguing about law and legacy. Trump turned off the sound. For a long moment there was silence. Then he spoke, barely above a whisper, "History doesn't care about rules. It only remembers who changed them." He stood up, walked to the window and looked out at the dark Atlantic. The tide was rising slow, unstoppable. And as the water shimmered under the moonlight, so did his resolve. He wasn't declaring war. He wasn't announcing anything. But in his silence there was power. In his restraint there was a message. America had heard him once before, and whether they wanted to or not, they were hearing him again. Because the truth was, Trump's greatest weapon wasn't his words. It was the echo they left behind. The echo that lingered long after the cameras stopped. The echo that made every politician glance over their shoulder. The echo that made a divided nation ask, once again, what if he's coming back? Outside, the waves roared against the shore. Inside, the man who once ruled the most powerful office on earth simply smiled. He didn't need to announce anything. The world would do that for him. And as the lights dimmed across the estate, one thing became clear: Donald Trump hadn't ended a chapter. He had just started a new one.